Hello world, hello Jason Isaacs, hello Politicos. Yes, it's been a while, but we're back, hopefully with a new and improved presentation on the British Constitution. I've been giving this an awful lot of thought, and hopefully, this time I think I've got it right. So take all your other stuff, chuck it in the bin, because this is going to be great. So, we start at the very beginning, and that is, what is a constitution? And a constitution needs to be perceived as two things. It is a system of rules that establishes the structure of a state and the principles by which it operates, by which I mean that a constitution is two things. It is principles, that is a contract, and it is a structure, that is a blueprint for government. So a constitution ideally should serve both of these two critical functions. It describes the relationship between the citizens and the state, and it describes the way in which the officers of those states operate and how they relate to the citizens. So that's very, very simple, and it doesn't matter whether you're looking at the UK Constitution, which, as we all famously know, is uncodified, or the American Constitution, which is codified. Both of those can be perceived as both a set of principles and a design for government. Okay, so the British Constitution. The curious thing about the British Constitution, and I'm sure you all know this already, is that we never had that Etch-a-Sketch moment. We never hit Control-Alt-Delete. And as a consequence of which, the UK Constitution has been evolving over, generations. We can probably start by looking at Magna Carta, which I believe was in 1215, and then on through a series of acts, which I will cover in a separate presentation. But again, the key point being that the Constitution never had a single Etch-a-Sketch moment. It never had that Control-Alt-Delete, let's start again. And as a result of which, the British Constitution is unique in the way in which it is established and the way in which it continues to evolve. So, it's an organic document, it's evolved over history, and it is still changing today. It is flexible, but it is not infinitely flexible. There has to be some sort of fixed point. There has to be some sort of inviolable purpose from which everything else flows. If a constitution doesn't actually establish things that can't be done, then what indeed is the point of having a constitution? If rule one is there are no rules, then we have a problem. So where is our constitutional fixed point? And the fun thing is that we can find it through Dicey. Dicey, A.V. Dicey, writing in the golden age of parliamentarianism, the late 1800s, he argued that the general principles of the British Constitution arise not from the declarations of the rulers, but from the decisions made in individual cases by an independent judiciary. Now, that is almost verbatim, but you know what? I can't find that quote anywhere. I committed it to memory about 10 years ago, and actually more than that, 16 years ago, and I can't find it anywhere. So if anybody can, please do let me know. Anyway, what it says is that the general principles of the British Constitutions are beyond the control of any one single entity or person. Instead, they are held to have emerged from the mists of time. Now, Dicey was a lawyer, so it kind of follows that he would want to put the lawyers in the box seat. But if we think that this is not actually within the power of the courts to change, but rather that they have been instrumental in steering the development of the British Constitution, then that's better. Don't for a second think that the judges are in control. That's not the case. What Dicey is trying to say here is that the Constitution has emerged through time and essentially through heuristic process. That's a wonderful word here. Heuristic process. That means the process of trial and error, which again brings us back to that notion of organicism. Organicism not necessarily being a good or a bad thing, just a state of affairs. Sharks are organic. They're not that bad most of the time, but if you happen to be swimming through shark-infested waters, you might consider their organic nature to be a positive disadvantage. Anyway, let's move on to the substance, that is the blueprint of this, and this is the way in which these principles are given shape and form. So we have our principles. How do we turn them into concrete things? And again, this is a model that you can use when we come to look at the American Constitution. And spoiler alert, I touch on that at the end of this presentation if I have time. So we have our principles. How do we give them shape and form? And these are the sources of the British Constitution. And I'll come to that in a second. Let's first look at those principles that Dicey held to have emerged from time. And there's only 5 of them. That's all you need to remember. We have the rule of law, which you should remember as being all laws apply to all people at all times and all in the same way, what I call the four alls rule. We have the sovereignty of Parliament, which establishes that Parliament is the highest level of legal authority in the legal system. We have parliamentary government, which says that government derives its authority from Parliament. We have a unitary state, which says that the UK has evolved through time to be the United Kingdom of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And we have a constitutional monarchy, which is the payoff from the Golden Revolution in 1688 that enabled us to go from a republic / military dictatorship, depending upon which side of the fence you stand on, to a restored monarchy under the Hanoverians. So those are the 5 constitutional principles. They have emerged from the mists of time, and as you will remember from Dicey, they are determined not by the declaration of the rulers, but rather they have emerged through legal history and precedent, and so they are beyond the meddling of any single entity or institution. The sources of the Constitution are as follows. Now, statute law is, of course, what comes out of Parliament, and because Parliament is legally sovereign, this is therefore the highest form of constitutional law, or indeed the highest form of law that we have in the country. Common law is precedent from the courts, so this is essentially judicial law, decisions in one court that are considered binding on other courts looking at similar things. It is, however, subordinate to common law, and so it is possible for the Parliament to pass a law that essentially can overrule huge chunks of common law, because that's the way our Constitution is set up. I know there are people out there who disagree with it, but you might want to check with Lord Neuberger, who knows a thing or two about this, possibly even more than me, and he explains it in beautiful detail in a speech that I will actually link to in the comments. So yeah, save your comments there, and you can send them to Lord Neuberger instead. Constitutional Convention, where we have lots of those, things like the Salisbury Convention, things like collective responsibility, individual responsibility, yada, yada, yada. Works of authority, where we've already mentioned Dicey. We can also add to that Bagehot and, of course, Erskine May. And I hope one day my former tutor, Geoffrey Marshall, whose book Constitutional Theory, which I think was published in 1781, is a real page-turner. Then we have treaties and laws of the EU Union. Now, I know that Brexit is a big issue, and Boris and David and Michael et al. Are doing their level best to extricate us from that, and yeah, you can save your comments on that for later. But as it stands, this is still part of our Constitution. Not just a part of the Constitution, but because of the European Communities Act of 1972, this is actually a higher form of law than statute law. We have passed a statute law to establish that European laws are higher than parliamentary output. Now, of course, as soon as we extricate ourselves from the EU, then that law will be reversed, and it's been established again in the Supreme Court that this needs to happen by parliamentary law. So in other words, we passed a law to get into Europe, we will pass a law to reverse that law, and once that law has been passed, that is the Brexit bill, once all of that is finally through, then ceteris paribus, we will no longer be guarded by the laws of the European Union. At least that is what the Brexiteers are telling us right now. Watch this space. I have a storyfy on that, and I will link off to that again in the comments. So we have the Constitution and the principles. Again, I just want to come back to this. These are the general principles that underlie or predicate the entire British Constitution. Everything else rests on these 5 principles. Remember, these 5 principles have emerged from the mists of time and are therefore beyond the meddling of any single institution or entity. And remember, the general principle of the British Constitution, as Dicey said, emerged not from the declarations of the rulers, but instead from the decisions made in individual cases by an independent judiciary. Again, if somebody find that quote for me, I will be delighted. Let's go back and have a quick look at democracy. This is a landmass. It has no political authority. It's just a patch of ground with trees and stuff. What makes it a political entity is people. People are what gives a state or a nation its political heft, its political ballast, if you will. Now, people generally like laws. Some of you may be looking at anarchism as an ideology, but if we put anarchism to the side for the time being, people want laws. If you need laws, then you need a lawgiver, and in the UK we've got Parliament. Now, Parliament needs to decide which laws it wants to pass, and in America they have one system, but in our system we have government. So government basically decides what laws Parliament will pass, and then once Parliament has passed those laws go back to government to be implemented. Now, people to Parliament, that is the principle of representative democracy. There we go. I've already got the arrows in place, but that's representative democracy. And then the idea that Parliament creates a government to help it organise itself gives rise to that notion of parliamentary government. And these are fundamental principles that are by no means inconsistent, but indeed in the United Kingdom have to run concurrently. So here we are, we have our Parliament, we have the government, we have the people, and we have a whole system of levels of accountability and authority. The people have granted authority to Parliament. Parliament has granted authority to government. These, again, the principles of representative democracy and parliamentary government. In exchange for that, we have a degree of accountability. Government should be accountable to Parliament, and Parliament should be accountable to people. And again, this is the reverse side, or the flip side of parliamentary government and representative government. So again, you need to get your head around these relationships if you're going to explain this with any degree of efficiency. This leads us to different levels of sovereignty. The people have political sovereignty. We know this. It's a democracy. A democracy is a system of government predicated on popular sovereignty. Parliament are the legal sovereigns. They are the highest legal authority they are the highest level of authority in the UK legal system. And the government has policy sovereignty. They get to decide the agenda. They get to decide what it is that the country is going to do. And that says political agenda for those normal human beings who are struggling with my handwriting. Now, I've left myself with 3 minutes to cover what is possibly the single most important idea that we're going to look at here. And that is the strengths of the British Constitution. Over a process lasting many, many years, I have essentially boiled this down to 3 key ideas. The first is that it is established by a clear set of inviolable principles. It's predicated on those 5 principles as articulated by Dicey and his idea that they arise not from the declarations of the rulers, but from decisions from the mists of time. The second idea, the second strength, is that there is sufficient flexibility in the application of those principles to allow the Constitution to evolve and remain relevant and indeed intelligible. And this is the blueprint. These are the sources that we get very excited about. So we have the contract, we have all of these principles, and again, the principles are given shape and form by the sources. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the application of those principles is controlled by the people's appointed representatives. That is democracy. The rule of law and parliamentary sovereignty and parliamentary government means that Parliament sits in the heart of our political system. And it's Parliament that gets to decide how the principles are put into effect through the various sources that we have. This is so incredibly important. I can't overstress how important it is that Parliament sits at the very heart of our Constitution. Parliament, the thing that we vote for, that is in the centre of our Constitution, and that makes the whole thing, in theory at least, legitimate. The weaknesses of the British Constitution are related to that. In the first instance, yes, we have entrenched principles, but some of them are a bit peculiar. We have a constitutional monarchy and a unitary state. Now, I don't want to get dragged into discussions right now about devolution, but it's hard to see how we could have unwound a unitary state through process of statute law. Yes, we could have reversed the 1603 and the 1707 Acts, but it would have been a real struggle to see how we would have actually unwound that constitutional principle. Essentially, it's an academic argument, but there we go. And we also have pre-democratic atavisms. The main problem, however, is that we have inadequate checks to prevent the concentration of power in the executive. We don't have any system of checks and balances, and as a result of that, the tail can wag the dog through all of the other mechanisms that I've explained in great detail in other presentations. Finally, we have no ability to entrench human rights because of all the things we talked about, because they're described by statute law. And so these are going to be the three main criticisms that you should deploy. Spoiler alert, this is how it relates in America. I've got 5 seconds left. It's the same model. We'll deal with that another time, and I'm completely out. Thank you very much. Bye.